What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we diving into a couple budget decks that I kind of came up with. I know these are kind of like concepts that have been floating around, but Crimson Veil really didn't add anything like brand new tribal wise or things to kind of super really build around. So a lot of what I'll be doing in today's video will be kind of retouch on some other decks that I may have done in the past, but kind of updating them for Crimson Veil, but make them a little bit in that sense of budget. The other thing I also did that's a little bit different than my past budget videos, if you've seen them, is I kind of stripped the decks down to feel like the bare minimum, including the rares and the mythics, that I feel like the deck still needs to have in order to really still make it work. So with that being said, the rares and mythics in the decks may vary, but I don't think there's any decks that really go super crazy into the rares and mythic things. I think the most expensive deck is 6 rares, and I think the rest of them are about 4 rares. I think one of them is 5, but one of the rares you get is from the starter decks. But with that being said, if you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, want to post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. It puts a +1/+1 counter on the channel, which definitely helps out a lot as well. And with that being said, let's just dive into the decks and let's talk about them. So with Crimson Veil, we kind of got like additions to archetypes that kind of existed when Innistrad Midnight Hunt came out, but I feel like we kind of got, you know, some additional cards that maybe help those particular archetypes. And the first deck up is Gruul Warewolves. If you haven't seen Gruul Warewolves, it kind of utilizes the new Nightbound Daybound cycle that has been introduced with Innistrad Midnight Hunt, and from there we kind of build around, you know, wolves and werewolves to hopefully make a decent sized team and kind of overwhelm our opponent. So in my stripped down like budget style version of the deck, we kind of, you know, focus on some of the new werewolves, while at the same time we still kind of utilize some of the key werewolves I think that came from Midnight Hunt that still make the deck kind of like tick regardless, even if they're at their little bare minimum. I think 2 copies of even the rares in the deck I think are still okay, but I think this one comes in at 5 total rares, one of them being Ranger class, which I believe you get from one of the new starter decks when you unlock them. So if you haven't done so, you will eventually have this, I believe, from one of the new starter decks. If I'm wrong, let me know in the comments below, but I believe this is kind of like a freebie rare if you acquired it from the starter deck. With that being said, we are kind of utilizing Tolvar. He's kind of like our way to kind of get tempo in the deck. The problem with like green and red, the colors don't really have a lot of access to drawing cards, and Tolvar kind of helps us with that, because whenever a wolf or a werewolf we control deals damage to a player, or combat damage to a player, we get to draw a card. And at the beginning of our upkeep, if we have 3 or more wolves or werewolves, it becomes night, and then we transform any number of human werewolves we control. And then Tolvar's flip side is that he has an X and a red and a green, and we can target wolf or werewolf we control +X+0 trample intended turn. X can also be 0, so we can just pay 2 mana to maybe give something that we may have on our side of the battlefield just trample if that's all we have mana for. So just keep that in mind. So if you're just trying to maybe get that additional damage through, just give something trample, or give multiple things just trample without paying the additional X. Other than that, you know, nothing too crazy in the deck, nothing super crazy that gets like updated or added to it in the rare and mythic slot of the deck. I didn't add any mythics to this deck. I will say first and foremost, if you're looking to possibly upgrade this and probably make it a little bit more aggressive, the problem when you go into like a stripped down budget version of a deck, the land bases where kind of like a lot of the cuts happen. If you can kind of like take these Highland Forests out and kind of make them into untap either pathways or the new dual land, I would definitely do so. Maybe add both of them. The one thing, it will affect our total you know, snow count of lands in the deck, which may affect things like Frostbite or Blizzard Brawl, but I do think being able to play everything and not have to wait a turn for a land to untap is definitely beneficial to us. Or you get lucky in the early game and maybe not have a turn 1 play, able to put your Highland Forest into play immediately. Other than that, like I said, upgrade to untap lands makes the deck run that much more smooth. With that being said, we do have 2 copies of Fearless Pup. I think this is an okay, you know, wolf to put in the deck at budget form. It's a 1 mana 1/1 with first strike, and then if we attack and we have 3 mana open, we can boast it for 3 and give it +2/+0 to end a turn. So just giving a little bit of additional pump is always very good. We have 3 copies of Frostbite for that little bit of spot removal. You know, this is kind of one of those things I feel like you can flex around with. Maybe if you add in the rare lands to the deck, maybe cut these, maybe do play with fires. That's kind of one of those things I think that depending on what you fancy, what you're really into when it comes to spot removal like this, I feel like you can swap this in and out with a couple various things depending on what you feel like works best for you. But this kind of works because we have only snow mana, so it deals either 2 damage or 3 damage if we have 3 or more snow permanents. Then we also have the Blizzard Brawl, as I think this is another great spot removal spell for these green decks that have green in them, because if we have 3 or more snow permanents, we have a creature we control fight target creature we don't control. Our creature gets +1/+0 indestructible, so essentially we can fight pretty much any creature our creature can hopefully beat. and get indestructible, and then we can attack with that indestructible creature, and our opponents still can't, they can chump block it, but our creature won't die regardless of if they have a proper amount of damage to kill the creature in that sense because of the indestructibility. Another interesting card, this looks like a new card, but really it's just a reprint from the previous set. So this card was actually a Midnight Hunt, and they decided to reprint it in Crimson Vow. I'm not really sure what the reason was there. Maybe they didn't realize, but we have Snarling Wolf as a 1-mana 1/1 with the ability that for 2 mana we can pay 2 and give it +2/+2 to end a turn, and we can only activate this only once each turn. That's kind of like the drawback. You'd be like, oh my god, a 1 mana that has a pump 2. That is the reason you can only do it once. So it's kind of, I feel like, an okay 1-drop. We kind of have 6 1-drops when it comes to creatures. In the 2-drop slot, this is kind of where I think the 1-drops need to set up the 2-drops. The first one being Hungry Ridge Wolf. I actually kind of like this card regardless of being in a budget form, and the fact that it's a 2-mana 2/2. As long as we control another wolf or werewolf, it gets +1/+0 and trample. So if you play your 1-drop and on turn 2 you play this, it's going to be a 3/2 with trample, which is definitely pretty decent for a common. Regardless, I think it really works what we're trying to do with the deck and just trying to be as aggressive as possible. A 3/2 Trampler is definitely pretty awesome. Maybe your opponent has to kind of deal with that immediately, or you're going to get in through some pretty decent damage in the early game. Then following that up with the Pack Song Pup. I'm not really sure how I feel about this card, if this is something we really want 4 copies of, but I do feel like 4 copies is pretty decent because I feel like you definitely want to draw this on turn 2, especially if you have a turn 1 drop as well, because at the beginning of our combat each turn, if we control another wolf or werewolf, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on Pack Song Pup, and when it dies, we gain life equal to its power. So it's kind of like one of these wolves that starts as a little small wolf and eventually becomes a bigger and bigger wolf as the game goes on, and if our opponent can't deal with it in the early game, now we start having a 4/4, 5/5, 6/6, 7/7 wolf that our opponent is just going to keep on growing if our opponent just doesn't get rid of it. I know it's easily targetable by like things like Portable Hole, Aspirant, Brutal Cathar are some decent ways you can spot removal it when it starts becoming too big, but nonetheless it's something that maybe your opponent may not want to really use that spell on, but now has to, because if they don't do it, then it comes out of control and they get overwhelmed. Like I said, that we are doing the 1 copy of the Ranger class. You could add more copies if you have more copies. I do think this is definitely a good card. It's a 2 mana with an ability that you can dump mana into it if you have nothing really else to do. When you first initially play, you get your 2/2 Wolf on for 2 mana as well. On top of that, you can actually add additional 2 mana, bring it to level 2. Whenever you attack, put a +1/+1 counter on target attacking creature. So one of your attacking creatures, you can give it +1/+1. And then for 4 mana, you can put 4 mana into it, make it to level 3. You have to go through the levels. You can't just jump to level 3 if you have the mana available. You have to have all 6 mana. But you can look at the top card of your library at any time. You may cast creature cards from the top of your library. So it's like giving you a little bit, a better way to dig a little bit deeper into the deck in case you're just not drawing your things that help you draw cards from your deck. Because we are not playing a lot of things that have Nightbound, Daybound, we are playing Unnatural Moonrise. It's a decent spell that allows us to make it nighttime on our turn before we decide to attack, which definitely helps us out with our wolves and werewolves that have the Daybound, Nightbound cycle. And what this card does is until the end of turn, target creature gets +1/+0 and trample, and then whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, we get to draw a card. So kind of gives us the effect of Tolvar, but in a card. And then we can flash it back for 4 mana, and this just allows us to set up nighttime when we want to. Just even if we play multiple spells on our turn, it won't cycle back till daytime until our opponent then goes. If we do cast 2-3 spells on our turn, but like I said, it helps us just kind of be that much more aggressive and kind of flip our cards and make them that much better. Then we have Moonrager Slash. This is kind of like, yet again, one of those things I feel like you must adjust the numbers. If you feel like you're struggling to get to that Nightbound side, I could see you always cutting it, maybe adding in some other spot removal. But I did think, this is a pretty decent card to have because I do think we have many ways to kind of get ourselves into that Nightbound cycle. The benefit of this card is it's a 3 mana, deal 3 damage to any target, but if it is nighttime, it actually costs 2 less, so it costs 1 red mana, so essentially it becomes a lightning bolt at nighttime. So then we can deal 3 damage to the face, to a creature, whatever we need to do with it. It's definitely a good card that I feel like fits very well with this style of deck. But like I said, if you feel like you're drawing too many of these and you feel it's not working with your mana, you can always cut down some, maybe add that additional frostbite, or maybe just add in like Play with Fire or something else if that's what you're looking for that spot removal. Or if you feel like there's too much spot removal, maybe add in more creatures. Up to you, I guess, on what you want to do there. Then you have Reckless Stormseeker, when I think this is kind of one of those key 3-drops in Werewolves or even Gruul aggro for the most part. It is a 3 mana 2/3, and at the beginning of our combat on our turn, target creature we control gets +1/+0 and gains haste. So you can target itself and then make it at 3/3 haster on the turn it comes out. When it flips to nighttime, it essentially has the same effect, but instead it actually gets +2. The creature will get +2/+0, trample, and haste until end of turn, so it becomes that much more aggressive. So if this comes out and it's on the flip side, you can make it a 5/4 with trample, which definitely is also very aggressive and definitely what we want to do. We want to hit our opponent as hard as possible, hopefully as quick as possible, because a lot of the decks in the format, if we go too late into the game, they'll grind us out. And unfortunately, I don't think this deck has enough gas to really grind out the more control-y, more like, controlling the board, taking extra turns type stuff. Our goal is to try to get our opponent down to 0 life, possibly by, the mid game of the game overall. Then the next card up in the deck is Hound Tamer. It's a 3-mana 3/3 trampler with a mana sink of 4 mana, 3 colors and a green. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. That's on that side. And then on the flip side, when it flips to nighttime, it has trample still. Other werewolves and wolves we control have trample, so it gives all our wolves and werewolves trample, which is definitely very good. And then still has the sink 4 mana into it, give target creature +1/+1 counter. I kind of like this card because it turns even our weaker werewolves, or even something like a Pack-Sunk Pup, into a trampler, which definitely is going to be very good for us to kind of get in that additional mana. Combine that with something like Tolvar, anything that has trample, even if our opponent chump blocks, that damage is going to go over, still hit them in the face. We're still going to draw a card from this effect. So definitely a card that sets up our ways to kind of keep our tempo going, keep us going momentum wise. And like I said, we go into the Tolvar, so our 3 mana sink in the deck, 1 colorless, 2 red, red and a green, 3/3, and then like I said, the ability of whenever our creature we control is combat damage to a player, draw a card at the beginning of our upkeep. If we control 3 or more wolves or werewolves, it becomes night, and then transform any of those werewolves into humans into werewolves. And then like I said, on the flip side, continues the whole whenever we do damage to our opponent, combat damage to our opponent, we get to draw a card, and then we can sink mana into it and give wolf or werewolf control +X/+0 and trample to end of turn. Just definitely a very good ability. Helps us kind of finish off our opponent, hopefully, if we get to that point. So definitely a good card nonetheless. And then the last card in the deck is going to be Burly Breaker. I wasn't really sure where to go. I felt like there was like a piece of the deck missing. I felt like we didn't really have anything that's really big, and I didn't want to go anything that was super expensive and the rare, so I kind of just went with the Burly Breaker. I know there's many options that are rare and mythic now for wolves and werewolves that you could probably do in this slot instead, but like I said, I kept it at an uncommon, so nothing too crazy and expensive if you kind of want to keep it on the budget side. It's a 5 mana 6/5 with ward 1, and then when it flips to nighttime, it becomes an 8/7 and ward 3, so definitely just this big creature that makes it hard for our opponent to target with like a direct removal spell, especially on the nighttime side, because they have to pay 3 additional mana. Just overall very, very big creature that hopefully by the time we flip it, this is going to be like one of the key cards that are going to help us finish off the game. And then the mana base is 10 mountains, 8 of the snow-covered forest, and 4 of the highland forest. I don't think the deck is super expensive when it comes to casting cost, so that's why I only went with 22 lands. You could go more if you feel like you're getting mana screwed, maybe cut out some of the spot removal, add in a couple additional lands. You probably want to... Fortunately, there isn't really another dual land that is common or uncommon right now currently in standard. So I would add another like copy of like a mountain and a forest to kind of balance it out, and maybe, like I said, cut back maybe a slash and possibly a frostbite. Like I said, if you want to make sure you hit your lands, 24 lands is usually ideal. There is no sideboard because we don't have any lessons in the deck. So overall, this is a pretty decent deck. I've had some decent success with it. It's always one of those things, especially early in a set release, that I'm always tweaking things. So you can always check out the deck list. If I'm, updating it, I will probably, tweak numbers, if anything, and kind of based off of games. I've only played a handful of games with each of the decks I'm going over today, so, things are always changing. I was changing it even up before I started recording as I was playing through games and kind of like, oh, that's not really working, or I wanted to, I was like, I need one more copy of this. So like I said, it's one of those things that is still early in the process, but I do think it's in a decent enough spot that, that you can maybe start here and then maybe tweak it as you feel like you need to based on how your games are going with the deck overall. So next deck up on the list is going to be a Rakdos Vampires budget style deck, and this is kind of harnessing the new blood tokens that got introduced with Midnight Hunt, or not Midnight Hunt, with Crimson Vow. Essentially, if you don't know what a blood token is, let me see if I can find one of the cards. A blood token is essentially tap 1 mana, discard a card, sacrifice this artifact, and draw a card. So it's like a clue in a way. Costs 1 less to actually activate. But we have to discard a card, so that's the one drawback to it compared to a clue. But overall, it's a mechanic that kind of ties in with the more vampire theme of Crimson Vow. So the goal here of the deck is kind of whittle down our opponent. Nothing's really super crazy and super large that's going to overwhelm our opponent when it comes to overall power. So I would say a card that really affects this deck a lot is a very is like a very low cost in meat hook. Unfortunately, I don't know if we're trying to be very aggressive. I think like vampires, if you're going very budget, has to be more on the aggressive side. It really can't go that mid to late game, so we can't really play the more expensive vampires that are currently in the set. So we do have to try to be as aggressive and get as wide as possible and hit our opponent as quick as possible with this deck, the way it's currently set up. But we went with 3 copies of Play with Fire, just as, you know, a little bit of spot removal in the early game, or possibly just ping our opponent in the face, because we do have cards that benefit us if our opponent has taken damage on our turn. So we have this card as kind of that versatility compared to something like a Frostbite or something like that. We also have Voldrin Epicure. It's a 1-mana 1/1. When it enters the battlefield, deals 1 damage to our opponent, and we also get a blood token for 1 mana. I actually think that's pretty decent. Like I said, we have cards that benefit us from dealing damage to our opponent. So we want to have ways to kind of get damage in, even if we don't attack them to the face. We also have Voldrin Stinger, just 2 copies of this, a 1-mana 1/1 that when it has first strike as long as it's attacking, and has a mana sink of tap 3, give a +2/+0 until end of turn. In the 2-mana slot, we have the first rare of the deck, which is the new rare. It's Voldrin Bloodcaster. It's a 2-mana 2/1 with flying. Whenever it or another non-token creature we control dies, create a blood token. So just a way to get benefit of if we swing in with something and it still dies, we'll get a blood token out of it regardless. And then whenever we create a blood token, if we control 5 or more, we get to transform it to its other side, which is a 3/3 blood bat summoner. And at the beginning of our combat on our turn, up to 1 target blood token we control becomes a 2/2 bat creature token with flying, haste, in addition to its other types. So it's still a blood token, but it's also now a bat creature with flying, and it stays a bat creature with flying. It doesn't go back to a blood token at the end of our turn. So it just makes our board that much wider. So that gives us something to do with our blood tokens. I do think this is kind of like one of those key rares in this kind of vampire deck that you want to have when it comes to actually making the deck. So I do think this is kind of something you definitely want to include. Next card up is the Blood Petal Celebrant. It's a 2-mana 2/1 that it has first strike as long as it's attacking, so it's exactly like the Voldrin Stinger, but just 1 more expensive. And then when it dies, we have to create a blood token. So it's kind of one of those things that gives us blood token on the death effect. So it's definitely good there. Combine that with something like a Voldrin Bloodcaster. That means now we're going to get 2 blood tokens if this dies with this out. So definitely also pretty sweet. Then we have the Falconwrath Perforator. It's a 2-mana 2/1. Whenever it attacks, it deals 1 damage to the defendant player. So even if the defendant player blocks it, we're still dealing 1 damage regardless. So just another way to get that free point of damage in. Just a 2/1, nothing too crazy about it, but I just think it keeps us being aggressive and makes our opponent have to make decisions, especially in the early game. Like this damage that we're doing to them in the early game will eventually add up, even if it's 1 point here, 1 point there, a couple attacks in. Next thing you know, our opponent's down to like 10, and then it puts us in a decent range to hopefully finish off our opponent then. Next card up is the Blood Tithe Harvester. It's a 2-mana 3/2. It's a new card from Crimson Vow. When it enters the battlefield, we create a blood token. And then we can sacrifice Blood Tithe Harvester. Target creature gets -X/-X on the turn, where X is twice the number of blood tokens we control. So this is kind of like one of our key cards that helps us get around much bigger creatures than some of our creatures, because a lot of our creatures really aren't that big when it comes to overall power. Our goal is just play a lot of cheap creatures, get wider against our opponent to get in for that damage. And this is kind of one of those cards that will help us get rid of those bigger creatures that may, gum up the board and doesn't really allow that, and don't allow us to get in for that, easy points of damage. So definitely a good card nonetheless. Then we got Hungry for More. I actually enjoy this card as being a card that helps us also be very aggressive, and it actually kind of works well with like Bloodcaster, because we create a 3/1 black red vampire creature with trample, lifelink, and haste, so that it can attack immediately when it comes into the battlefield. And if it does survive combat, we have to sacrifice at the beginning of our next end step, so it just dies at the end of turn. Then we can flash it back and cast it again, so we can kind of be as aggressive as possible, possibly cast this multiple times in the same turn if we have 5 mana, at least 5 mana open. And it just, like I said, synergizes very well what we're trying to do, just trying to be as aggressive. Regardless if, the creature gets in for all the damage or a couple points of damage, those couple points, like I said, add up over time. So definitely a good card that kind of works with our strategy we're trying to do. Then the next card we have is Vampire Socialite. It's a 2-mana 2/2 with Menace. And then when it enters the battlefield, if an opponent has lost life this turn, this is one of those cards that take advantage of it. We get to put a +1/+1 counter on each other vampire controls. So this is kind of one of those cards that pumps up our team. And then as long as an opponent has lost life this turn, each other vampire control enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. So one, it pumps up the team when it initially comes in, and then it pumps up every additional creature that comes on the battlefield after our opponent has taken damage, either on the same turn or on the follow-up turn when we possibly, get in for some points of damage, play some more creatures to kind of get the board, get wide on the board, and get in for that damage. Then next card up is Falconwrath Forebearer. It's a 3-mana 3/1 flyer. Can't block. whenever it deals combat damage to a player, we get to create a blood token. So this is kind of one of those creatures that when we get over and through for damage, it's going to create blood tokens for us in that way. And we can actually pay 1 black mana, sacrifice 2 blood tokens, and then actually return it from our graveyard to the battlefield. So it's kind of one of these key recurring cards, and I do think it kind of also one of those cards that you probably want to have for the deck, in the sense that even if our opponent blocks it and ends up dying, we can pay 1 mana, we can get the effect, and then we can get it back on the battlefield now, and as if nothing happened. And it's one of those things that will cycle blood tokens in and out for us and helps us utilize them for something else, maybe then other than turning Boulder and Bloodcaster into possibly its other side. But nonetheless, good card. Cards that get back from the graveyard with some sort of effect that's not super expensive are definitely very, very good. Next card up is Vampire's Vengeance. It's 3 mana, deals 2 damage to each non-vampire creature, and then we create a blood token. So overall, just like that, if we get against like a mono white deck or a deck that's playing a lot of small things or a lot of creature tokens, it's kind of a way to clean the board up real quick. And then we create a blood token as well. Like I said, most of our deck is vampires. We do have 1 card in the deck, creature-wise, that's not a vampire. It's one of those things that I'm kind of like wondering, should I really keep it or should I replace it with a vampire? So it's kind of where I'm at right now with that card. When we get to it, you kind of know what I'm talking about. But it's kind of this is kind of one of those cards that kind of helps us kind of wipe the board a little bit and doesn't really affect us in that regard. It's actually beneficial to us because we do get the blood token as well. So just a way to clean up that board of all those little small tokens that people can create. Next card up is Voldrin Ambusher. It's a 3 mana 2/2. Enters the battlefield if an opponent has lost life this turn. It deals X damage up to 1 target creature or planeswalker, where X is the number of vampires control. So it's kind of, this is our other card in the deck that's kind of like a spot removal spell built in itself. But the one drawback is our opponent does have to lose life first before we actually get this effect. The deck isn't super expensive, so they're typically, when we get this out, we could be doing 4 to 5, maybe even 6, 7 damage to one particular creature, depending on how many our vampires have survived through the turns. But overall, pretty decent card, and then it becomes a decent either attacker or possible chump blocker, because after that point, we're really using it for its effect, not really for the power that is in the card. But like I said, it helps us just kind of get in through those points of damage and get rid of those bigger creatures that could get in our way. And this is a card that I'm not really 100% sure on. It's Death Priest of Gruul. It's a 4 mana 2/2. It is not a vampire, it's a tiefling cleric. Skeletons and vampires and zombies we control get +1/+1. And at the beginning of our end step, if a creature has died this turn, we can pay 1. If we do, create a 1/1 black skeleton creature token. So it's kind of one of those things that just helps us create a little bit of an army in case things start dying. Even though the skeletons aren't, vampires, getting in for any points of damage is definitely beneficial to us. And even if these skeleton tokens die, if we just want to be as aggressive as possible and still just trying to get those points of damage in, we can always continue paying 1, and we can actually create an additional skeleton token. And if we chump block or block something on our opponent's turn, we can pay 1 at the end of at the beginning of, or never mind, it's only at the beginning of our end step. I'm thinking of a different card, but we can pay 1, get a skeleton creature token. It's just going to be one of those things that kind of helps us generate tokens even if things are dying on the battlefield at the end of our turn. So overall, pretty decent card, but like I said, it's the one card in the whole deck that gets hit by Vampire's Vengeance, so it's kind of where I'm like, probably want to cut it, and maybe either get additional copies of some other cards in the deck, or possibly look to see if there's other commons or uncommons in the vampire slot that could probably fill this role for being just maybe either a big creature that does some sort of thing that helps us with blood tokens, and or maybe just, I'm not really sure. I'd have to kind of do some experimenting, but for now, I do think it still works, because even if it does die to this, it does pump the rest of the team, which just helps us be that much more aggressive, so that's definitely beneficial as well. And then for the mana base, we have 8 of the swamps, 8 of the mountains, 4 of the sulphurous mires, 2 of the field of ruins. We're coming in at 22 lands. I don't think the deck is, the overall mana curve is not super expensive. Majority of the mana is at 2 mana, so we're not really trying to draw mana, we're just trying to draw threats. Field of Ruins good, especially if you kind of get matched up against an opponent who pays creature lands. Just having a way to kind of get rid of those creature lands, because we don't really play any sort of spot removal that is not built into a creature or some sort of effect. Just having this available to get rid of those lands is definitely good for us. We aren't playing snow lands, so we are playing just regular lands. The Sulphurous Mire is just our helpful land that's going to help us splash for that black and red. Like all my other decks, if you want to upgrade the mana base, always go for the untapped lands. The new dual land, the new black-red dual land is definitely very good. I think it's either from this set, or if it's not, it's from Midnight Hunt. And also the pathway is also very good. It helps us out as well. But other than that, I think the deck, works. It's definitely aggressive. It's very susceptible to a Meat Hook Massacre. But you know, any aggro deck is usually acceptable to some sort of board wipe, so that's the one drawback. But it is a fun deck. It is playing the vampires. I will eventually do a video on the deck, and like all my decks in this video, I'll be tweaking them as I kind of see fit and kind of figure out what's working, what's not working, as you know, people start playing the set more and figuring out, you know, what's good, what's bad of everything overall. So this next deck up on the list is a Selesnya Humans deck, and it's a little bit different than I think the Selesnya Humans deck that you probably seen me post here on the channel just the other day. This one's kind of going around playing like a very wide, aggressive, tokeny style deck. That the goal here is just trying to get very wide on our opponent. We have various ways to generate tokens. We are utilizing the new training mechanic. If you don't know what training mechanic is, I don't think it's explained on any of the cards that I have. But some cards like Torrens, for example, has this ability called Training, and whenever it attacks, if it attacks in with a creature that has greater power than it, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on it. And the one benefit of like this card in, for example, is why I think it's definitely an include, is that whenever we cast a creature spell, we get to create a 1/1 green white human creature token, also with Training. So it's like he just helps us become that much more aggressive. I think this is the only deck that has 6 rares in it. It's 2 of him and then 1 of the Hamlet Vanguard. And I think the reason why I need to have 4 of these is just because the way the deck plays, trying to just generate, you know, a bunch of little small creatures. That one helps us kind of, you know, make our Hamlet Vanguard just very, very big. This is one of the also new cards from Crimson Vow, and I do think this is kind of one of the cards I think you need to have for the deck, because it benefits from us creating all these little small 1/1s. But when it enters battlefield, we get to, it enters battlefield with 2 +1/+1 counters on it for each other non-token human we control. So it definitely benefits us from all our cheap creatures we play in the deck overall. You know, this thing can come out as like a 7/7 on like turn 4, and our opponent's just like, I don't know what to do with it. And it also has War 2, so it makes it harder to remove. It makes them have to pay additional mana in order to remove it or spot remove it. So they have to either global wipe it or pay that additional mana, or their spell or ability is gonna be countered. Other than that, the deck is, like I said, fairly on the cheap side. The mana curve is really in the low cost stuff, and we have just a few of the more expensive stuff. So the mana base isn't super expensive. I think it is a total of 23 mana. It's 9 plus 8, which is 17, 21, 24 mana because we have the Kabir takedowns. But nonetheless, we'll kind of go through the list and kind of talk about each of the cards. We have Cold Spell Cleric in here because the deck is trying to generate also +1/+1 counters on it. This is a card that helps us kind of, you know, generate those +1/+1 counters on it. I forgot to mention the other card that's also from Crimson Vow that we're going to mess around with here in this deck is Sigurd Paladin. It's a 4-mana 4/4 Paladin that, as long as we put 1 or more +1/+1 counters on a creature this turn, Sigurd Paladin has Trample and Lifelink. And we also have a mana sync ability of 1 colorless, a green, and a white. Target creature control with a +1/+1 counter on it gains Trample and Lifelink at the end of turn. So it kind of makes all these creatures that we're putting counters on just become, you know, help us gain some life, get through some extra damage, because unfortunately the problem with Hamlet Vanguard, it doesn't really have any way to get that, you know, bulkiness that it has through to our opponent. So Sigurd Paladin is going to be that card that we can play to hopefully, you know, give it Trample and Lifelink so we can gain a bunch of life and get in through some decent damage. And they, you know, it's one of those things they can't just put a little 1/1 in front of if we have this and this out, because if we have the mana available, we put it on this. Next thing you know, we're getting through like 4 or 5 points of damage, and our opponent's like, wow, I should have probably blocked with a little bit more creatures. But back to the other spells of the deck. Code Spell Cleric, because a lot of the cards in our deck are cheap, and we use a lesson board in this deck, we are casting multiple spells on the same turn. So this is definitely a good card. It is a card that we can definitely get that additional +1/+1 counter on it, as this being the second spell. We also play 4 copies of Guiding Voice to get into our lesson board to, you know, learn and find a particular card depending on the situation. If we're trying to be more aggressive, or if we're, you know, missing some of our mana, we want to clean up, you know, the mana splash, because like I said, when you play common mana and then play just basic lands, it's hard to get the particular mana sometimes the right way. Sometimes you draw too much of one color, too much of another color. But we don't really want to slow ourselves down by playing, you know, more tap things like Terramorphic Expanse or something like that. So unfortunately, we have to go to the sideboard, or go to the sideboard, go get Environmental Sciences and kind of slow us down that way. But it allows us to still cast multiple spells, gain a little bit of life and whatnot. Then we have also Homestead Courage. It's a 1-mana sorcery spell that puts a +1/+1 counter on target creature control. It gains Vigilance to end a turn, so it allows us to attack in, not having to tap to attack with it, and then we can flash it back to cast it additional time. We either do it on the same turn, or we can always cast it on the following turn to kind of keep on stacking, you know, these like creatures that we could possibly attack in and not have to tap to attack into our opponent. Then we have Star Pupil. It's a 1 mana 1/1, and it just battlefield a +1/+1 counter on it. So it's essentially a 1 mana 1/1. But when it dies, it actually puts +1/+1 counters on target creature with control. We're kind of combining this with the next card in the deck. It's kind of like something I'm messing around with. It's kind of like my little idea here is that if we put additional +1/+1 counters on this, we can swing in aggressively with it. And then as long as we have multiple other creatures and our opponent can't wipe those creatures before we move the counters, we can just pass the counters around and kind of keep the counters stacking and kind of getting the creatures bigger and bigger as we play the game. Then we have Contortionist Trope. It's an X and a green 0/0 human that enters battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. So this is kind of one of those things that as we get into the late game, we draw this. We have mana to sink into it. We can make this just a very big creature right off the bat. And then on top of it, it has the Covenant ability. As long as we have three creatures of different power, we get to, at the beginning of our end step, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature control. So it's just another card that helps us put counters on things to keep things getting bigger and bigger, just to kind of overwhelm our opponent in that sense. We have big creatures, we get very wide with creatures, just a bunch of various things that just kind of make our opponent have to make very critical decisions, or they're going to die eventually just based on all the pressure we're putting on them. Then the next card up on the deck is Ambitious Farmhand. Like I said, because we are only playing 22 lands, or 24 lands, I should say. This is kind of a cool card, I think, in the sense that it's a 2 mana 1/1. That doesn't seem very great, but when it enters the battlefield, we can search our library for a basic Plains card, reveal it, and put it to our hand. So at least on the turn, if we can play it on turn 2, it keeps us, with tempo. We're not missing a land drop. And then it has a Covenant ability that if we have, the 3 creatures of different powers, we can tap 3 mana, 2 white, and a colorless, and we can make it into a 3/3 lifelinker, which is also very good. Becomes a very good blocker. We can put +1/+1 counters on this, so we can either use it as an attacker at some point and then get it for some damage and also gain life in the process, so definitely good as well. Then we also throw in Kabir Takedown as really our only removal in the deck. If our big creatures aren't making our opponent, either use their spot removal and or chump blocking or just throwing creatures in front of it, this is going to be our way of taking advantage of us playing a lot of little small creatures, because it is a 2 mana instant speed removal spell that deals damage equal to the number of creatures we control to target creature or planeswalker and opponent controls. And then the other benefit, the other side of it is it's a land in case our opponent's not really playing creatures or indoor planeswalkers, so it does have a use in case we need that. It doesn't have any effect based on what our opponent's playing, so it's like kind of like a 2-for-1 and definitely a good spot removal spell, and 3 copies of it. I do feel like it's pretty good. Then we have Perish of the Blade Trainee. It's a 2 mana 1/2. It has Training, so another card that has Training. And whenever it attacks with another creature with greater power, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. So just another card that gets bigger. Another card that in itself generates +1/+1 counters on it. That kind of goes with that Sigarda Paladin. So just a pretty decent card for 2 mana. Nothing too crazy, but definitely fits well with our budget. Then we also have Unruly Mob, a card in itself that if we attack it even with our tokens that we generate in the deck, and they do die, it's just whenever another creature we control dies, we get to put +1/+1 on Unruly Mob. So just another card that benefits us from even just attacking aggressively, regardless of if our opponent can block our creatures and kill them in the process. If our opponent doesn't deal with this, it can become also very big, and then they have to kind of figure out how they want to deal with it. We combine this with something like a Sigarda Paladin. We can tap the 3 mana, sink it into it. If this is very large, we now have the Trample and Lifelink on this, and our opponent then has to either throw a bunch of things into it, or we're going to get a bunch of life and deal a lot of damage to our opponent's face. Then we have Join the Dance as kind of like a 2 of in the deck. It's a 2 mana sorcery that we create 2 1/1 white human creature tokens that we can also flash back for 5 mana. So yet again, just another card that helps us get very wide. It works very well with something like a Kabir Takedown. Just us trying to generate as much threat and get as big as possible against our opponent. We kind of already went over these 2, but Hamlet Vanguard, just a very good 3-drop that I feel like works for this style of deck. It can become very, very big even at turn 3 as long as we hit the cards we need to. And it has War 2, so it makes it hard to spot removal, especially in the early game when mana is very, is very limited at certain points. Then we have Torrens, Fist of the Angels. Benefits us. It helps us, generate more threat, because every time we play a creature spell, we get to create a 1/1 human soldier creature token with Training. So even if these are we play this, we play a creature spell, we create a creature token with Training, we attack with Torrens and the human creature token on the following turn. This doesn't grow, but the human creature soldier token then grows, and then we create other things that then eventually get bigger. So definitely overall a very good card. I think that will help us just keep on generating threats and makes our opponent definitely have to consider what they want to do when it comes to either doing spot removal and things like that. Sigurd Paladin, we kind of already went over. It's just a 4-mana 4/4 with the ability that whenever we put one or more +1/+1 counters on a creature this turn, it itself gets trample and lifelink, and then we could actually pay 3 mana and give something else trample and lifelink as long as there's a +1/+1 counter on it. And then into the 5-drop slot, kind of a more suspensive card in the deck. It's Maja, Breadguard, Protector. It's a 2/3 for 5 mana. It doesn't seem very impressive. Other creatures we control get +1/+1, so it's just a kind of like a rally the ranks kind of ability, but built into a creature. And then whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control, we get to create a 1/1 white human creature soldier token. So just yet again another card that just builds into our board threat, just tries to get as big as possible, as quickly as possible against our opponent. And then the main base, like I said, is 9 plains, 8 of the forest, 4 of the Arctic tree lines, and then we have 3 of the Kabira takedowns. So overall, we have the lands. And then if you want to take a quick look at our sideboard for what we're including, we have 2 environmental sciences, 1 reduced to memory, 1 containment breach, 2 expanded anatomies, and 1 introduction to annihilation. Just trying to keep the rares down. I know you could, if you have the lessons, you can always throw the rare lessons in here if you feel like you need them. But overall, I think this deck still is pretty decent for what it is, even at a budget form. You can always play around with the numbers if you want to. You know, Taurens, we don't really need more than probably like 3 is probably a decent amount because you can only play 1 on the battlefield. Hamlet, I think, is definitely a must-have at 4. Get the mana base, you know, to the untapped land, so you can always have the mana source you need, whether it's Pathways and the dual lands. I think you need both in this deck. We're not playing Snow Madness for really anything else other than just the dual land, so having, you know, the non-basic rare lands are definitely a very good upgrade for the deck. Other than that, I haven't really messed around too much from building this up into a more upgraded version. Maybe when I do the video, when I do the gameplay of this, and then I do the upgraded version, I will kind of like play around and see what's kind of working. How can we make this deck even better when it comes to overall power? But nonetheless, a fun deck that definitely, like I said, the games I played, it definitely overwhelms your opponent when it definitely gets going. But with that being said, let's get on to the last deck and let's talk about it. So this last deck is a little bit of something I kind of had laying around when I made my budget Dimir Zombies. And then I saw, I believe, Legend made a video with the new card that came from Crimson Vow, which is Necro Duality. Essentially, it's an enchantment. Whenever a non-token zombie enters the battlefield under our control, create a creature token that is a copy of that creature. So overall, it's a card that I feel like is definitely a need in this deck to make it even more threatening, even at a budget version. If we can get this out and then start casting any of our creatures, regardless, even if they're only uncommons and commons, it just overwhelms our opponent, and then we stack, you know, certain abilities, but depending on that. Another card we have in the deck is the Champion of the Parish. I think this is like a must-have in a zombie deck because it allows us, you know, play it on turn 1, and every zombie played therefore after, and if opponent doesn't remove it, this becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, and then combine that with Necro Duality. Every time we, you know, cast another zombie and it copies with Necro Duality, we're putting 2 +1/+1 counters on it because I'm putting 2 creatures onto the battlefield. So overall, the deck is pretty good. Another card that I've actually been messing around in this that I've been liking is actually Falcon Abomination combined with Necro Duality, because we cast Falcon Abomination, it creates a 2/2 black zombie creature token. We copy it with the Necro Duality, we get another one of these and then another zombie token. So overall, pretty decent there. The one little like hitch with the deck is the Nefari Betrayer King. We are playing Snow Madness, so we have Nefari. But you know, the problem is this is a legendary snow creature. So we can only have one of them. Even with Necro Duality, we can have 2, even though the token is still legendary. It's still a copy of this, so we have to choose 1. But the one cool trick with it is if you do actually pay the 3, it actually the actual copy comes on the battlefield tapped, but the copy of it comes in the battlefield untapped. So just a little trick there in case you want possibly like a sneaky blocker. So that's one little trick there. The other thing too with it is this is actually creates a decent loop when you bring this back and stuff with Gruul of Therbrin. This is kind of like our card that's going to help us dig deeper into the deck. It's whenever Gruul of Therbrin or whenever zombie we control dies, we get to look at the top card of our library. If it's a zombie card, we can reel it. We get to put it into our hand. If you don't, you put the card into your hand. You can maybe put it into your graveyard. So it's kind of one of those things that kind of mills us. If we don't like the card on top, we get to put a zombie into our hand if we need some sort of threat. Or we can keep the land or card on top and just decline both actions overall. But cool card that kind of has some cool little synergy with this. Just even if we can only have one of them, we can always, you know, sacrifice the real copy and then keep the token on the battlefield, and then just triggers this over and over again. So overall, decent little loop there. But nonetheless, let's kind of go through the deck list and kind of talk about it. So Champion of the Perished, great 1-drop, 1/1 that gets bigger and bigger every time we play a zombie after it. Shambling Gas, I still think is a very good zombie. You know, it helps us with a little bit of ramp. It can also get rid of pesky things if we attack in with it and our opponent decides to block. We can give something -1/-1 to get that point of damage through. Also, a decent card to use for exploit, to either ramp or, you know, just kind of be able to sacrifice it. So definitely a good card to use for those exploits cards that we have in the deck. We have Priest of the Haunted Edge, decent chump blocker in the early game. As we build up our land base, we can tap it to sacrifice it, deal -X, give target creature -X, where X is the amount of snowlands we have until end of turn. So definitely a good way to kind of remove a creature that may have indestructibility. We have Blade Stitch Scab, definitely a good card that combines with Necroduality. Play this with Necroduality out. You get 2 Scabs, giving all our creatures +2/+0, giving each of these +1/+1, or +1/+0, so definitely get there. Skull Scab is pretty cool. Combining that with, you know, other exploit cards in the deck, we exploit maybe our Shambling Gas. We get a 2/2 zombie. These don't have decay, so these stay out on the battlefield, unlike the ones from Midnight Hunt. So definitely a good zombie. And then allows us, whenever we exploit even with our other creatures in the deck, we can still get a 2/2 zombie token out of it. We have Falcon Abomination, like I said. Good card in the deck, kind of works really, really well with the Necroduality, just creating that additional threat. You know, we get 2/2 zombie DK tokens and 2/2 flyers. The one problem is we don't have a lot of flyers, so this is definitely like our only flyer we have in the deck. I have 3 copies to Flip the Switch. Just a decent counter, just maybe a little disruption. Maybe our opponent's not expecting us to play any counters if they think we're just playing a bunch of aggro. Also creates a 2/2 black zombie creature token as well with decay. We have Stitched Assistant, a 3 mana 3/2 with exploit. When it exploits a creature, we can scry 1 and also draw a card. So this is another card that just kind of helps us dig a little bit, helps us, you know, kind of fix the top of our card of our library in case we don't like it. Just another decent card that has exploit. We already kind of went over Archghoul the Throbbing, just a card that helps us whenever one of our another zombies we control dies. Just allows us to dig a little bit deeper into our deck. It doesn't actually matter if it's a token or a non-token, so any of our zombies, if they die, we get to reveal the top card of our library regardless, or look through the top cards of our library regardless of it, regardless of that zombie being a token or not. Bellstinger is a card I think a lot of people are going to enjoy that play any sort of mono black. It's 3 mana 3/2 with Death Touch with exploit. If we exploit a creature, target player draws a card, or draws 2 cards and loses 2 life. So just another card that helps us dig a little bit deep into the deck. As you can tell, we're not playing Deadly Dispute just because I think, you know, using exploit is kind of what we're going to use our Shambling Gas for instead in this deck. Necroduality is kind of like the 2 of in the deck. I would say if you have the mythic rare wild cards, probably want to have 4 of these in the deck just because you definitely want to have this out. It changes the game completely once you have this out at a whole. Not a lot of enchantment removal currently in the meta, so this is definitely something that once it gets out, there's not many cards that really can really target it, other than I think like an Aspirant for the most part, or if your opponent's playing that human werewolf creature that you can sacrifice for 1 mana and destroy target artifact or enchantment. But nonetheless, not many people are playing that. Most people are being aggressive. If this card pops up more, or more enchantments pop up more, maybe people will start playing some enchantment removal. But for now, I think this is definitely a good card, and especially in this deck, I think it's a card that you want as many copies as you can have in the deck as possible. Then the last card before we get into Nefari is the Organ Hoarder. It's a 4 mana 3/2. Allows us to kind of look at the top 3 cards of our library. It's essentially look at the top 3, draw 1 of them, mill the other 2. So it's just definitely a good card that helps us dig a little bit deeper into the deck. Maybe throw something like a Nefari into the graveyard so we can cast it for the 3 mana instead of the 5 mana. So just overall pretty decent card that just helps us, you know, help us keep our tempo going and hopefully keep our hand full. So it helps us with that. And then, like I said, 3 copies of Nefari, the Betrayer of the King. The one little thing that doesn't work very well with Necroduality, but it's a 5 mana 4/3 that gives others snow and zombie creatures control +1/+1, and then we can tap it for 3 and return it from the graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So overall, very good zombie lord that kind of has a decent recurrent effect. It actually costs cheaper to return it from the graveyard than it does to actually cast it. And then the mana base is 8 of the snows islands, 10 of the snow swamps, and 4 of the ice tunnels. Yet again, we're only playing 22 lands. The deck isn't super expensive. Really, the 4 drops are the more expensive things. Nefari can be cheaper if we can get into the graveyard before, you know, we actually play it, either by milling it or, you know, just if it somehow gets discarded. But nonetheless, deck is fun. It definitely works. It's definitely a fun deck. I would say if you're looking for an upgraded version of deck, I think Legend did a video of it today, where he kind of like, you know, removes a lot of the cards that I have in here as kind of like, you know, placeholders, I guess, until you get the rares and mythics. But this is still a decent start if that's something you're looking into. If you're really a fan of zombies, definitely go ahead and maybe check that video out if you're looking for a way to take this deck and bring it to the next level. But guys, if you like this video, hit that like button. If you want to let me know what deck of these are your favorite down in the comments below based on what you see here just in the video, let me know. If you're new here, want to post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. But with that being said, I'll see you in the next video.